In the darkness of Henderson House, a group of friends dared to defy the veil between worlds. What they found there, however, transcends the boundaries of nightmare. The silence in the diner was thick, heavy, a suffocating blanket that had settled over them since Daniel's funeral. Ethan stared into his lukewarm coffee, the dark liquid reflecting the hollowness. He felt inside. It had been weeks, but the raw edge of grief was still sharp, a constant gnawing pain. Across the table, Olivia traced patterns on the condensation of her iced tea, her eyes distant, lost in memories. Caleb, usually the life of the group, sat with hunched shoulders, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Hazel, ever, the pragmatist, tried to maintain a facade of composure, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her forced calm. Daniel's death had ripped a hole in their tight-knit circle, a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. They had been inseparable since childhood, their lives intertwined like the roots of an ancient oak. Now, one of those roots had been severed, leaving the rest to wither in the desolate aftermath. Ethan's guilt was a constant companion. He had argued with Daniel the night he died, a trivial disagreement blown out of proportion. If only he had said something different, perhaps Daniel wouldn't have stormed out, wouldn't have been on that rain-slicked road when the accident happened. The what-ifs echoed in his mind, a relentless chorus of self-reproach. Caleb, ever the researcher, had thrown himself into his studies, seeking solace in the dusty pages of forgotten lore. He had always been fascinated by the occult, by the mysteries that lay just beyond the veil of the mundane. Tonight, however, his research had taken a darker turn. He slid a worn, leather-bound book across the table, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and faded script. "I found something," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "a ritual, a way to contact him." Olivia's eyes widened, a flicker of hope battling with her skepticism. "Contact who? Daniel?" Caleb nodded, his gaze intense. "It's an ancient rite, meant to bridge the gap between worlds, to allow us to speak with those who have passed." Ethan scoffed, the sound harsh in the quiet diner. "Caleb, this is insane. We can't actually believe this, can we?" Hazel, however, was intrigued. "What kind of ritual?" Caleb opened the book, revealing a diagram of intricate symbols. "It requires specific ingredients, a location of power, and a conduit. But it's said to be possible to truly speak with the departed." A tense silence fell over the table, the weight of their grief and the impossible hope hanging in the air. The void Daniel left behind was too vast, the pain too unbearable. A desperate gamble started to appear as a viable option. "Are you serious?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "As I can be," Caleb affirmed. The old Henderson House stood on the outskirts of town, a relic of a bygone era, its weathered facade and boarded-up windows whispering tales of neglect and forgotten secrets. Local legends painted it as a place of dark energies, a nexus for paranormal activity. It was the perfect, or perhaps the most disturbingly appropriate, setting for their desperate endeavor. As they approached, the air seemed to grow colder, a tangible chill that seeped into their bones. The overgrown yard was a tangle of weeds and gnarled trees, their skeletal branches reaching out like grasping claws. The house itself exuded an oppressive silence, a stark contrast to the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the town. Inside, dust lay thick over everything, coating the decaying furniture and the peeling wallpaper. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. They found their way to the main parlor, a large room with a grand, if dilapidated, fireplace. Caleb had already prepared a list of the necessary ingredients, a bizarre assortment of items that ranged from the mundane, a lock of hair, a personal belonging, to the obscure, dried herbs, a piece of obsidian. As they set about gathering the items and arranging them according to the ritual's instructions, an unsettling feeling crept over them. The house seemed to watch them, its empty windows like vacant eyes. Shadows danced in the corners of their vision, and the silence was punctuated by faint, unidentifiable noises, creaks, whispers, the rustling of unseen things. Olivia, her senses heightened, was the first to notice the subtle anomalies. The temperature fluctuated, dropping suddenly in certain areas of the room. A faint, metallic scent, like blood, lingered in the air. And then there were the whispers. They were barely audible, just a faint susurrus in the air, but they seemed to be saying something, repeating a phrase that was just beyond comprehension. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan strained his ears, but heard nothing. "Hear what?" "Whispers," Olivia replied, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. I think they're saying his name." Diaries of Nightmare. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. Even he had to admit that the house felt wrong, charged with an energy that was both unsettling and palpable. He glanced at Caleb, who was intently studying the ritual diagram, his face illuminated by the flickering. "A candlelight." "We need to focus," Caleb said, his voice tight with anticipation. "The ritual must be performed precisely." As they prepared the final elements of the ritual, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all directions, swirling around them like a phantom chorus. The house seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the moment when the veil between worlds would be pierced. The final preparations were complete. The circle, marked with glowing chalk, pulsed with an eerie light, and the air crackled with a palpable energy. In the center, a worn photograph of Daniel lay amidst the array of ritualistic items, a focal point for their desperate hope. Caleb, his voice trembling slightly, began to recite the ancient incantation, the words rolling off his tongue in a forgotten language, each syllable resonating with a strange power. As the incantation reached its crescendo, the candles flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. A cold wind swept through the house, even though the windows were tightly sealed. The whispers intensified, morphing into a cacophony of voices, a chorus of the damned. Olivia gasped, her eyes wide with terror, as she saw faint, translucent figures swirling in the shadows, their forms shifting and indistinct. The photograph of Daniel began to tremble, and a faint ethereal glow emanated from it. A voice, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the image, a distorted echo of Daniel's familiar tone. Who calls?" it rasped, the words sending a chill down their spines. Ethan, his skepticism wavering, felt a surge of adrenaline. "Daniel, is that you?" the voice replied, but it was no longer Daniel's. It was a distorted, malevolent growl, a sound that seemed to claw at their sanity. "You have opened a door that should have remained closed." The room plunged into darkness, and the candles extinguished, leaving them in a suffocating blackness. A wave of icy cold washed over them, and they felt a presence, something vast and terrifying, lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. Olivia screamed, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence, as she saw a figure, tall and gaunt, materialize in the center of the circle. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its face was a mask of pure malevolence. Objects began to fly across the room, propelled by unseen forces. The walls seemed to close in, the house itself twisting and contorting around them. The whispers had become a deafening roar, a torrent of voices screaming in agony and rage. "We need to stop this," Hazel yelled, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "We need to close the circle." Caleb, his face pale with terror, fumbled for the ritual book, his hands shaking uncontrollably. But it was too late. The ritual had taken on a life of its own, a dark force that was spiraling out of control. The tainted ceremony meant to bring Comfort had unleashed a terror far beyond their comprehension. The house had become a living nightmare. The walls pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. The floorboards warped and twisted, and the shadows danced with malevolent intent. Ethan stumbled through the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear Olivia's terrified screams echoing through the house, a chilling counterpoint to the cacophony of whispers and growls. He turned a corner, his hand outstretched, and recoiled in horror. A figure stood before him, its form shifting and indistinct, its eyes glowing with a cold, unholy light. It was a manifestation of his deepest fear, the guilt that gnawed at his soul, personified in a grotesque form. It whispered accusations, its voice a distorted echo of his own self-doubt. "You killed him," it hissed, the words dripping with venom. "You could have stopped him, but you didn't." Ethan stumbled backward, his mind reeling, his guilt a suffocating weight. He tried to deny the accusations, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his regret. Meanwhile, Olivia was trapped in the parlor, the room transformed into a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers. The translucent figures she had seen earlier had materialized, their forms more distinct, their eyes filled with malice. They reached out to her, their cold, spectral hands grasping at her, their whispers a chorus of torment. Olivia screamed, her voice raw with terror as she tried to fend them off. She felt a coldness seeping into her bones, a chilling touch that drained her of her strength. She knew that if they touched her, she would be lost, her soul dragged into the darkness that had consumed a house. Caleb, his hands still trembling, tried to find the page in the ritual book that would help him close the portal. But the pages seemed to shift and change, the words blurring and rearranging themselves. He felt a presence behind him, a cold, suffocating weight that pressed against his back. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat, and saw a figure standing in the shadows, its face obscured by darkness. The figure whispered his name, its voice a low, guttural growl that resonated in his ears. Caleb's research had unearthed terrible things, and the figure knew his sins. His driving curiosity was now his undoing. Caleb fell to his knees, his mind reeling, his sanity fraying at the edges. Hazel, however, refused to succumb to the terror. She had always been the strongest of the group, the one who kept them grounded, the one who faced their fears head-on. She knew that they were all going to die if she didn't act quickly. Hazel grabbed a heavy wooden candlestick and began to smash the many small ritual items, destroying what she could in an attempt to disrupt the ritual. She yelled to the others, attempting to pull them from their terror-induced paralysis. "We have to fight. This is our fault, and we have to end it," she screamed, smashing a mirror and sending shards flying. The house shuddered, and the shadows recoiled slightly. It was a small victory, but it gave her a sliver of hope. She knew that they couldn't defeat the entities, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to banish them, to close the door they had so foolishly opened. The house groaned, as if in agony, as Hazel continued her desperate attempt to disrupt the ritual. The entities, enraged by her defiance, turned their attention to her, their forms coalescing into a nightmarish tableau of terror. Shadows stretched and elongated, morphing into grotesque shapes, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They lunged at her, their spectral hands reaching out like claws. Hazel fought back with a ferocity born of desperation, her strikes fueled by adrenaline and the primal instinct for survival. She smashed a ceramic vase, sending shards of porcelain flying, and used a broken piece of a mirror as a makeshift weapon, slashing at the shadows that swarmed around her. "Leave us alone," she screamed, her voice hoarse with fear and exertion. "Go back to where you came from!" Her words seemed to have little effect. The entities were relentless, their attacks growing more ferocious, their forms becoming more tangible. The house itself seemed to be working against her, the floorboards warping and shifting, the walls closing in, the very air thick with oppressive dread. Ethan, his mind still reeling from the guilt-ridden hallucinations, watched in horror as Hazel fought against the unseen forces. He knew he had to help her, but his limbs felt heavy, his body paralyzed by fear. He forced himself to move, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind battling against the lingering effects of the entity's influence. He grabbed a heavy, wooden chair and charged into the fray, swinging it wildly, his strikes connecting with the shadowy forms. The entities recoiled momentarily, giving Hazel a brief respite. Together, they began to battle their way towards Olivia and Caleb. Olivia was trapped in a vortex of shadows, the spectral figures swirling around her, their whispers a deafening chorus of torment. She felt her strength fading, her spirit weakening, the coldness seeping into her soul. She could see Daniel's face in the shadows, not the face of her friend, but a twisted mask of malevolence. He mouthed silent words to her, and she felt the truth of his demise. He had been taken, and now something else wore his face. Caleb, meanwhile, was lost in a labyrinth of fear, his mind trapped in a nightmarish realm created by the entities. He saw visions of his past, of the dark secrets he had unearthed, of the consequences of his obsessive curiosity. He was drowning in a sea of guilt and regret, his sanity hanging by a thread. He felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder. A deep voice reverberated through his mind. "Your search ends here." As Ethan and Hazel battled their way through the house, they could hear the anguished cries of their friends. They knew they were running out of time. The entities were growing stronger, their control over the house tightening, their grip on their souls unrelenting. They had unleashed a force that was far beyond their comprehension, a dark power that threatened to consume them all. The house seemed to feed on their terror, and the ritual drew closer to its terrible conclusion. The walls began to bleed, not metaphorically, but truly bleed, a thick black ichor that seeped from the ancient wood paneling. Ethan and Hazel, battered and bruised, finally reached the parlor. The sight that greeted them was horrifying. Olivia was suspended in midair, her body contorted at unnatural angles, her eyes wide with terror, the black ichor of the house wrapping around her like grasping tentacles. Caleb was slumped in a corner, his body twitching spasmodically, his eyes vacant. The entities had coalesced into a single towering form, a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and whispers, its eyes burning with malevolent intensity. Hazel, her resolve unwavering, grabbed the ritual book from Caleb's trembling hands. The pages were still shifting and blurring, but she managed to decipher a few key symbols. She knew that they had to reverse the ritual, to close the portal they had opened. But the incantation was incomplete, fragmented, a jumbled mess of ancient words. "We need to find the missing pieces," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "We need to complete the ritual." Ethan, his mind clearing, remembered the symbols he had seen earlier, the ones that had appeared on the walls and the floor. He relayed them to Hazel, and she frantically scribbled them down, her hands shaking as she tried to piece together the fragmented incantation. The entity, sensing their attempt to thwart it, unleashed its full fury. The house shook violently, the walls cracking, the floorboards splintering. The entity's shadowy form lunged, attempting to grab Hazel, to silence her. Ethan threw himself in front of the attack, and the being's black tendrils wrapped around him, bringing the feeling of absolute cold. He cried out in pain, a searing agony that seemed to burn through his very soul. Hazel, ignoring her fear, pressed on, her eyes fixed on the ritual book. She completed the incantation, the ancient words, rolling off her tongue with a newfound power. The air crackled with energy, the symbols on the floor glowing with an intense light. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and dissolving. "Now!" Hazel screamed, her voice echoing through the collapsing house. "We have to say it together." Ethan, despite the agony coursing through his body, joined her, his voice hoarse but determined. They repeated the completed incantation, their voices resonating with a strange power, binding the dark forces that had been unleashed. The portal began to close, the swirling vortex of shadows shrinking, the whispers fading into a distant murmur. The entity, its power waning, let out a final deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The black ichor withdrew from Olivia's body, and her contorted form fell to the floor. The entity dissolved, and the house began to still, its walls returning to their normal state. The air cleared, and the oppressive darkness receded, and the unbearable cold left with it. They found Olivia, breathing but unconscious. Caleb remained catatonic, lost in the depths of his own terror. Ethan was alive, but the tendrils had left terrible burns. They had closed the door, but they knew that the echoes of the forgotten rite would linger, a haunting reminder of the darkness they had unleashed. The dawn crept through the shattered windows of the Henderson house, casting long, pale fingers of light across the wreckage of the parlor. The air was still thick with the residue of terror, the lingering scent of decay, and the faint echo of whispers. Ethan, his body aching, his mind reeling, helped Hazel carry Olivia outside, away from the cursed house. Caleb remained inside, a broken shell of his former self, lost in the labyrinth of his shattered mind. They sat on the overgrown porch, the first rays of sunlight warming their weary bodies. The silence was heavy, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of the town. They were alive, but they were changed, their innocence shattered, their souls scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Olivia stirred, her eyes fluttering open, her gaze filled with confusion and fear. She looked at Ethan and Hazel, her voice trembling as she asked, "What happened?" They told her what they could, their words halting, their memories fragmented, the events of the night a nightmarish blur. They spoke of the ritual, the portal, the entities, the terrifying truth about Daniel. They told her how she had been captured, how the house's ichor had tried to take her, and of Caleb's fate. They omitted the details of Daniel's corruption, deciding to allow her to keep a small piece of her innocence. Olivia listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She struggled to reconcile the events they described with the reality. She knew the world had shifted on its axis. The familiar ground beneath her feet had turned to shifting sand. "We have to go back for Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Hazel shook her head. "It's too dangerous. He's gone. We can't help him now." Ethan nodded in agreement. "We have to leave this place. We have to forget what happened here," but they knew they could never truly forget. The echoes of the forgotten rite would linger, a constant reminder of the darkness they had unleashed. They had peered into the abyss, and the abyss had peered back. The things they had witnessed, the terrors they had faced, had left an indelible mark on their souls. They would carry the weight of their experience with them forever, a chilling testament to the dangers of tampering with forces beyond their understanding. The house stood behind them in the slowly brightening morning, a dark stain on the landscape, a monument to their terrible mistake.